All right, everyone. So, our last lecture is on art and cultural heritage, looting and destruction. So, in this lecture, we're going to be talking about some of the things that are happening to these ancient artworks in our present day. Think back to the Lindsay Addario, lecture where she was talking about the war going on in the Middle East as well as North Africa and many of these injustices of war, as well as techniques or crimes of war. So we're going to look at a couple of different themes. One is the destruction or iconoclasm and the erasure of culture, so similar to the concept of damnatio memoriae. So reasons to do this could be to ideology, neglect, or disregard for the object as well. There's also looting and the appropriation of objects. So think back to when we talked about the Stele of Ur-Nammu, it had gotten destroyed, whereas the Stele of Hammurabi was actually reappropriated and set up elsewhere to show that they had conquered the old Babylonians. There's also ideas of restitution and repatriation. So, for instance, the British Museum houses many works from all over the world, including some that were illegally acquired in the 19th century. Think back to Giovanni Belzoni, and that kind of culture with the early archaeological practices where artifacts and pieces of artwork were just essentially taken from their original location. So we're going to see how this has occurred actually over many millennia and is certainly not a new phenomenon. There have been several trends and themes that have occurred throughout history, and we're going to take a look at how those events and beliefs are connected to our contemporary society. So I'll give you a couple of seconds to read the issues. These are just a few issues that are or questions about this kind of process. So go ahead and take a read. On this next slide, this is a video, or no, excuse me, this is an article about sculptures from Hatra. So we talked about the city of Hatra with the Parthian kings. So we can see that the kings are represented here. So these individuals were made by the Parthians, which inhabited Susa and Iran, again around the mid-3rd century BCE. And they were considered some of the finest examples of artworks from this culture, and also contained some inscriptions in Aramaic. Now, the museum itself, the Mosul Museum, was actually raided. They covered it on the news. You can actually Google it still. So there's a complex layer to this debate that is the question of authenticity of the artworks, as some believe many of the sculptures in this video were actually copies. So the article will discuss these works in great detail. This video shows ISIS actually invading the Mosul Museum. I believe it's in Baghdad. It's a little bit difficult to watch for me just because you see them destroying these artworks and just this kind of disregard for any sort of cultural heritage. So the British Museum, as well as other museums like the University of Chicago or the Met Museum in New York, are making attempts to kind of right some wrongs, but now more so than ever preserve our history. So we do have things like digital reconstructions. We also have the disbursement of certain sculptures, for example, the Lamassus discovered by Layard, that went to multiple nations. So part of this fuels the argument that had they not been in possession of another country, we would have nothing left of this ancient civilization that is part of our world heritage and connected to all of our histories. So now the Hatra King and the Lamassus statues destroyed were authentic, and now valuable information on those cultures has been lost forever. But many of the objects are actually preserved so that they can be sold later. So all of the claims about destroying the image in the name of Allah becomes a ruse that is employed to justify this criminal activity, as well as fund terrorist acts. Many of the claims made by ISIS is towards the prohibition of idolatry, which is the worshipping of false idols. Now, think to the Christian biblical narrative of the golden calf. Moses had brought the Jews to Egypt, and when he went up to Mount Sinai, he took a long time, and during that period, the people made a golden calf and began to worship it. God was furious at this betrayal, and when Moses returned, he brought with him the commandments, which includes one concerning the worship of false idols. So likewise, many extremists believe that by destroying these artworks, they are following the example of the prophet. So, the Prophet Muhammad is often used as a sort of excuse by these extremic groups. The Quran itself does not forbid any kind of figural imagery, but very similarly to the messages in the Bible, it is just against the worship of false idols. So, the Kaaba is a shrine that was constructed presumably by Abraham, under the instruction of God, and was specified to resemble the house of heaven. So, the Kaaba is located in the city of Mecca in Saudi Arabia, which is the holiest site in all of the Islamic religion. And the people who lived in Mecca before the onset of Islam were polytheistic and had filled this temple with statues of idols representing various deities. So the story goes that when Muhammad returned to Mecca and conquered the city, he marched to the Kaaba and destroyed the false idols because the one God is the only one to worship. However, there is no mention, again in the Quran, that prohibits images. But the reasoning behind this iconoclastic or image-breaking attack goes well beyond this singular reason. These trends of looting and destruction of artworks and monuments is not limited to contemporary society, but has occurred over an extensive amount of time from the beginning of human history. Iconoclasm is the rejection or destruction of religious images as being heretical. The Byzantines went through several periods of iconoclasm between the 9th and 13th centuries, and much of it surrounded the debate as to whether images were aids in worshiping the divine or a distraction. So during these periods of iconoclasm, Byzantine Christian images were removed from public display, some were even burned and destroyed. So right before the classical era of Greece, in the 16th and 5th centuries BCE, the Parthenon was destroyed during an invasion by the Persians. So the structure that we know today was actually completed around the mid-5th century BCE from funds collected from all the city-states of Greece as a commemoration of their defeat of the Persian army at that time. But again, in the late 17th century, there was a war between the Ottomans and the Venetians. Both Venetian and Ottoman cannons destroyed portions of the Parthenon. This type of destruction due to war is something that has been occurring for a very long time. And this is where the range of global responsibility to preserve these invaluable monuments and artworks becomes debated. Looting is another commonality that goes along with the complications in the debate for cultural heritage and restitution. An object may be in the possession of a certain culture, but that is only because in the past the monument or artwork was looted and removed from its place of origin. We have already seen certain artworks that have been removed from their original locations and displayed in the capital of a conquering culture, again to reference the Stele of Hammurabi. So the modern question then becomes who gets to keep it. In the mid-13th century, these sculptures were removed from the city of Constantinople and brought to Venice, where they were placed at the top entrance of St. Mark's Basilica. So, this idea of prominently displaying a sort of what you call a spoil of war is a psychological tactic to assert dominance. Looting and the repurposing of art would be common throughout history, including the Romans, who displayed spoils from the temples of Jerusalem. We also saw the cult statues being carried away under the Assyrians. And in the 18th century, Napoleon actually forced the Pope in Rome to agree to the Treaty of Tolentine. Now, this treaty stipulated that the French Commission would select 100 master works from the Vatican collections, including many other items from all over Italy, including the bronze horses that were themselves looted by Venetians approximately 600 years earlier. So this is to show you guys an image here of Napoleon. So you have him in these art galleries as well as these beautiful spaces. We see the sculpture of ancient Greece in particular was very desired by Napoleon. We can see the Apollo Belvedere in the top left, as well as the Laocoon and his sons from Hellenistic Greece in the bottom right. Napoleon's actions set a precedent and served as an example for looting and controlling visual art as part of a strategy for empire building. It also served a role in the Nazis' attempt to retrieve works that had not been repatriated to Germany, and many that did not belong. Repatriation is the process of returning an object to its place of origin. There's an excellent documentary, the trailer of which is to this link. This is about the House of German Art, as well as Hitler and his investment in art. So, the House of German Art was one of his first projects. We can see him speaking here at its opening. The House of German Art was made not even 10 months after Hitler became Chancellor, and it was his first major public building project. So this exhibition only featured German artists and catered to Hitler's taste of representational paintings based on nature, with finely finished and clear narratives. So the art of Greece and Rome, as well as the Italian and Northern Renaissance, were very desirable to him. Hitler himself was an art student who was rejected twice from art school, which some say actually contributed to his obsession with art and this kind of dramatic display of what was acceptable art and what was known as quote-unquote degenerate art. In fact, these images are actually some of Hitler's artworks. Now, at this point, many art schools were participating in these radical and newly innovative artistic techniques, such as Cubism with Pablo Picasso, or Impressionism with Vincent van Gogh and Monet. So that meant that the previously popular style of this very hyper-realistic academic type of painting, taken from nature, was now overdone and no longer desirable. The Chapman brothers are contemporary artists, and in preparation for their show titled, "If Hitler Had Been a Hippie, How Happy Would We Be?" in 2008, the Chapman brothers actually bought several watercolors by Hitler. Then, the two brothers painted the backgrounds of Hitler's watercolors with rainbows, smiley faces, floating hearts, and psychedelic skies. Now, some think that by defacing Hitler's art, the Chapman brothers are only fueling the hatred of certain artworks and are no better than him. But also, some believe that his art deserves to be defaced because of what he did, or that this is, again, a type of damnatio memoriae being performed in the modern world. 3 days after opening the House of German Art, the Nazi regime displayed the degenerate art exhibition. It was used as a way to incite prejudice against modern art. So the artworks of Vincent van Gogh, Pablo Picasso, and many other modern artists of this time. These artworks totaled around 16 6,000 works taken from museums and private collections. So many of these artists were treasured pinnacles of the modern artistic movements of the 20th or 19th and 20th centuries. The link goes to a short clip that is actual footage from the exhibition if you guys want to check that out. It's kind of cool to watch people around literally in, during Hitler's time. So again, we have another case where artworks were despised. They were considered degenerate. But we see here an auction. They're being sold because of their value to help support the Nazi cause. Some works were also burned in order to purge any art that did not purely reflect the Nazi ideals of Germany. This news article reports on Hitler's speech at the opening of the Degenerate Art Exhibition in 1937, where it reads, "Modernism in art, Herr Hitler said at Munich yesterday, was a decadent byproduct of Bolshevist Jewish corruption. There were still artists in Germany who, after 4 years of National Socialism, persisted in following the cult of modernism in their paintings. These artists," he declared, "should be treated as dangerous lunatics and handed over to the state for sterilization." So this is a very extreme reaction to these modern types of painting. The Monuments Men, if you guys are familiar with that movie, actually played an extremely active role in recovering the stolen masterpiece from these German repositories. So we can see the Monuments Men here, as well as women. One of the most famous instances was the recovery of the Ghent altarpiece, and it was located in a mine in Austria. And one of the most famous objects known from the Northern Renaissance, it was painted by Jan van Eyck in 1432, and this was Hitler's most prized possession. And it actually has quite a history of being looted, but remains at least relatively intact today. It was repatriated to the St. Bavo Cathedral in Ghent, Belgium, and remains there under the protection and preservationist efforts of the Getty Museum. If you guys take a look at this link, this actually directs you to it's about 10 minutes on a history of the Ghent altarpiece. So if you're interested, I do suggest you take a look at it. If anything, take a look at this link here. This is one of the kind of innovations that technology has been able to do for art. If you click on this link, you can really get up, there's actually something like 1 million pixels in this reproduction of the Ghent altarpiece. So you can really see these wonderful details that are so indicative of Netherlandish painting and of Jan van Eyck, which also, interestingly, comes from miniature painting traditions. So, cultural heritage. The heritage doesn't consist of money or property, but of culture, values, and traditions. It represents our history and our international identity. It is also the result of a selection process, a process of memory and oblivion that characterizes every human society constantly engaged in choosing, for both cultural and political reasons, what is worth being preserved for future generations and what is not. So our cultural heritage is contingent on the fact if it's important or not. We discussed how Assyrian rulers were creating these new capitals in these kind of dilapidated cities so that they didn't have to interfere with any previously existing monuments. So the same kind of thing is done here, where these institutions are trying to preserve, but not everything can have the same kind of protection, unfortunately, especially in these very conflict-filled areas. The Director General of UNESCO, Irina Bokova, is quoted as saying in 2013, "There is no choice between protecting human lives and safeguarding the dignity of a people through its culture. Both must be protected as the one and same thing. There is no culture without people, and no society without culture. So this is our last lecture. So we will be returning to the classroom on Monday, April 30th. Remember to print and staple your notes and answers to the discussion questions in a hard copy, which will be due at the beginning of class. Continue reviewing the final exam review materials, and we will have an in-class final exam review on Monday, April 30th. See you all soon.